Thom began collecting fossils in Texas when he was 8. When he was 12, his family settled in San Jose and he began mining and collecting more seriously. Thom hunted the dumps and tunnels of the old mercury mines, and later he began to mine bentonite. Thom sold his mineral collection when he was 19 for enough money to go to Mexico City and study anthropology. Man. In 1970, he returned to the agate world and began to earn his living as a lapidarist. For 20 years, he made his living as a cabochon artist. Gradually, he shifted away from lapidary work and became a dealer in polished specimens of agates and jaspers. Over the years, Thom assisted Gene Mueller with his mining operation at the Morrisonite mine in Oregon and the Agua Nueva mine in Mexico. Thom enjoys meeting new collectors and devotes his time to finding agates of the finest quality for his clients. Thom Lane has created a website, The Agate Trader, in order to connect with agate and jasper collectors. Today, Thom will be speaking on one of the most well-known varieties of thunder eggs in the world, those from the Baker Ranch. Let's welcome Thom Lane.
Well, I'd like to thank the organizers of this show for the chance to talk about Baker eggs. The first visit to the Baker mine happened when I was going along with Gene. We stopped in Deming. And on the trip back, the person that we stayed with there as we got ready to go down to the mine took me to the Baker pit. And so I got to dig some Baker eggs then, and that was quite a while ago. So I've had a lot of experience with this. I met the miners and that sort of thing. But I'd particularly like to thank a couple of people that helped me get my information together for this show. One of them is Dr. Goetze, Jens Goetze, who's our speaker and was our speaker. And so when I was going to give this talk, I contacted him and said, what would be a good contemporary source for information about thunder eggs? And he referred me to a paper by a colleague of his, Christopher Breitkreutz, also a professor at his university. And this paper deals with the formation of the spheruolite developing into having a cavity, which is the source of all the thunder eggs. They fill much later with agate. So I had that wonderful paper, and I also met a fellow named Rick Hoblet, who's a retiring USGS volcanologist, and he spent several days with me trying to get it through my thick head how the special volcanoes that produce the kind of material that can bear thunder eggs forms. And he also visited the Baker pit, so we climbed around in the Baker pit together. And so my talk is basically put together with information that I've had from these two exceptional sources, which is a big help to me. My talk. I should lower your expectations. There's not a single picture of a Baker egg in this presentation. But there's a lot about the history of the mine, the people who mined it, and so we'll start with this view of the Baker pit. This was in 2008. The glory days of the production at the Baker mine were between 2005 and 2010. From this point forward, they had, and actually leading up to it too, they used a large excavator, and the pit opened quite a bit. This is 2008. The pit was completely backfilled earlier this year. So the whole area to the right, the lower right, became much deeper and went further back. So this is about, even though they'd been mining here for quite a while, this is about half of as big as it eventually became. So this is what I'm going to talk about just roughly, and I will talk about the formation of thunder eggs briefly, but I won't repeat anything, if I can help it, from John Stockwell's marvelous presentation on spherulites and thunder eggs earlier today. And then this will segue into the description of the geology of the Baker pit. So this is a map just to situate you in terms of where the Baker pit is, Baker mine. Upper right is Deming, and in the lower left it says the Baker pit or mine. So this is about 33 miles south-southwest from Deming and about 6 miles above the Mexican border. And it made Deming a good jumping-off place for trips to Mexico. Now, this is a map that was made on top of a normal topo map of the area. This is only about 3 miles by 3 miles. And in the upper left, there's a green dot, and that is the Baker Pit, the location of the Baker Pit. Those other red dots are other thunder egg deposits that are nearby. And a friend of mine, the geologist Jeffrey Anderson, took the trouble to go to each of these old diggings and prospect carefully and has specimens from those deposits, which I think are kind of interesting. Probably the very finest potential for really beautiful thunder eggs now that the Baker mine is exhausted is the one with the red center in the top row, and that's and one of the early pits. These pits were dug in the 60s, early 60s, and by people who had rock shops in Deming. And I think you all realize that back in those days, the 60s and 70s, there was a craze for rock hounding that there was so much material available that in a summer, something like 10,000 people came from out of state to Oregon to dig rock. This was a huge activity, and down in Deming, there were 3 guys who had rock shops of sorts. Paul Tavernier was one, so that we have the Tavernier pits, and then there was also a guy named Pete Gitney who was actively prospecting out on the Baker Ranch, and there was a guy named Eddie Lindbergh who will play a big role in the history of this mine. So these are pits that they had dug, and they still exist. And one wonders why they didn't dig at the Baker deposit, and that was because the surface thunder eggs there were known as goofballs. Small, brown thunder eggs with very little agate and very little color, so that they chose to prospect in these pits rather than the Baker mine. And it wasn't until later that the Baker mine became a serious focus of the mining there. And at the same time, in these early years, there was a guy named Paul Colburn, who's also known as the Geode Kid. And he was in high school in California, and his dad took him out prospecting, and he got the bug, and he dropped out of high school. And for the rest of his life, he was a devoted thunder egg miner and eventually author. And so I wanted just to mention that Paul Colburn is also beginning his story at this particular point. Now, I'll just go on here. These are the guys who had the rock shops, and I mentioned Paul Colburn here, so we move on. This is the Geode Kid from his book, True Tales of the Geode Kid. And on the left, you see him in his hat, barebacked, and his comment here is, I had my hair tucked under my hat, and I was wearing a snake agate necklace. So you get the idea that Paul Colburn, the Geode Kid, was a counterculture guy, and he spent a lot of time over in San Francisco going to rock concerts and being involved eventually in the politics. He's also a poet, wonderful writer. So these are some pictures of the Geode Kid in his early days in the 60s. Now, this is him again, quite a bit later. His hair is still growing, and he has one of the big thunder eggs from the Never Again mine right near Deming. And this is their rock shop, which is right by the Rockhound State Park just outside of Deming. And it's kind of interesting. He had a partner that was with him from early years. They used to travel around in an old 1986 Volkswagen bus digging thunder eggs. And they eventually opened a little rock shop up in Oregon. But these 2 guys did a lot of intensive digging. And so this is the only picture I had of Christopher Blackwell, just taken a few years ago. Now, once the Geode Kid had this background in Oregon, then he heard about thunder eggs in Deming. He started visiting and digging over there because there were a lot of thunder egg deposits around the Rockhound State Park. And eventually, he teamed up with one of the early guys, Eddie Lindbergh, who'd dug prospects out there, and Eddie had placed a claim that included the Baker Pit. So Paul Colburn and Eddie Lindbergh got together, and when a couple of years later, in around 1982, Eddie Lindbergh sadly passed away, and over the years, a few years after that, the Geode Kid continued to supply Eddie's widow, Emma Lindbergh, with thunder eggs. They had a junkyard in downtown Deming, and it had a big area, a big room that he sold thunder eggs out of. Eddie was an active prospector and had lots of claims. So after Eddie had passed away, Paul and Emma became good friends, and Emma allowed Paul to place a claim specifically on the Baker mine that would allow them to go deep before the claims were just placer claims, which only allowed surface operations. So once the Geode Kid had the claim to the Baker mine, he and Paul and his partner Christopher Blackwell began to dig by hand in the center of the deposit. And this is the tunnel that they dug. Took them 5 years. They dug by hand with just probably a cobra drill to allow them to use explosives. Paul would be down at the bottom digging, and Christopher would be up at the top. There was a hand crank. Christopher would hand crank the rock that had been dug out up to the surface and put it on a dump, and the eggs went into buckets. So at around 1985, I'm sorry, they had decided on the basis of this tunnel that this was a big deposit, very interesting. And for the first time, Paul hired a fellow who was an equipment operator, and this is the tunnel, the opening, not tunnel, but a ramp that leads down into the early hand diggings. You can see there's some 2x4s down at the bottom. That's what's left of the hand digging ramp that they used. So this is the beginning of the Baker Pit. And here is a picture of the pit a little bit later, and it shows the way they mined. And the backhoe would dump a load of freshly scraped off material from the wall onto this sloping pile up above where you see the guys with the buckets, and it would be dumped, and the thunder eggs would roll down, and they'd put each of the collectors would put eggs that they thought were good into their buckets. At the end of the day, each person's pile would be divided into 2 equal stacks by the miner, and at the flip of a coin, one of those stacks would go to the rock shop that Paul Colburn had in Deming, and the other half would belong to the miner. So that the entire process of mining this mine, from this early beginning on up to its closure this year, was done without paying anyone for anything. They were all volunteer miners who worked for a share of eggs. And so the mining of this operation was a completely amateur operation. It was owned by Paul Colburn, so he had the claim, and he set the rules, and it happened without any kind of problems or arguments or thefts or any injuries. And it's an example of those early style American days when people, just for the love of agates, would devote a large part of their life to a mining operation that didn't have anything to do with the normal mechanics of a totally business-oriented type mining operation. So I think that's interesting. A little later, Paul Colburn, who continued mining in that pit until 2000, when he became too ill and too worn out from mining to continue, at which point he retired to the rock shop and became an author, wrote a 1,000-page long book called The True Tales of the Geode Kid, which reads a lot like On the Road. It's a great adventure book, and he talks about all of his mining trips in there. But he also, before that, wrote a very seminal work on thunder egg formation and thunder egg deposits. And so his fame is for several careers. He's quite an interesting character. You can see he never cut his hair after 1960. And in 2000, when he could no longer mine, he continued to supervise the operations a bit. And these two guys here had taken a real interest in the Baker mine, and they are Lawrence Seng on the left and Bill Anderson on the right. Again, you see the method that they used for mining. And so these guys became the principal miners. And a main person, the one hired employee, Dale Grant, who operated the equipment, is shown here building a ledge, and this is to protect the people who are down below from crumbling of the material up near the top, which wasn't so solid. So the material below is strong enough to support a working backhoe with about a 40-foot drop-off. And this was a safe thing to do because of the solidity and the strength of the deposit itself. Now you can see Dale Grant, the operator on the left there, happy man in his office. And here he is sitting up on top of probably what was about a 60-foot sheer drop-off in a large excavator. This is when they realized they were getting really great eggs, around 2005. And so these are just a couple of views of the mining operation. Now, this was when the pit was at its very deepest. This is about, the bottom of the pit here is about 90 feet down. And if you look behind the arm there, you can see a couple of the miners with their buckets, again, mining in the same manner. After this point, this end ran out of material that produced thunder eggs in every direction except to the left where they'd started in the beginning. And they moved over there, and as they worked over in that direction, the quality deteriorated until the dig in around 2014 or 13, when it was determined that the eggs they were getting didn't pay for the rental of the equipment, at which point a decision to backfill the pit was reached. And I was over there for 4 or 5 days watching the backfilling of this historic mine. And on the left is the second day, and they've just cut a ramp through the tailings there down into the pit so they could begin to backfill. This is the fourth day. You can see now that you can actually see the backfill on the bottom of the pit. And they continued to work a couple of days more. And I believe right now if you went there, you'd find that where the Baker mine had been is about as flat as the terrain around it. So on this day, Lawrence Seng showed up with a friend named Bob, and on the right is the geologist Jeffrey Anderson. And they had all been active figures in the mining, been the guys down there with the buckets. And they came out to see what they could find as the tailings were moved, and they found some good ones. Now, the next part of my talk deals with the formation of thunder eggs, and based on Dr. Breitkreuz's paper from Germany, and also on information I got about the rhyolitic flows from Rick Hoblit. The picture on the left shows a 600-year-old pile of basically obsidian, volcanic glass. It's not all black. It's mostly usually a pale gray-green. And it has flow banding in it. And you can see how it's been pushed up. And the characteristic of a rhyolitic flow is it's very thick. It's very gloppy. It's very viscous. And it comes up, and it's so thick that it frequently, and not frequently, but occasionally will block the vent, and you'll get an explosive eruption. But those are not part of this immediate story, so I won't go into that. It's quite fascinating. But you can see the flows on the right there, and you can see how it's both gloppy, like this stuff on the left, on the top, but it's also continuing to flow. So this stuff doesn't flow like the shooting red floods of basalt that you see, or the Hawaiian volcanoes. This is very slow. And here is a spherulite, as our speaker this morning talked about. And it's interesting what we can deduce from this, because there's a little round ball in the center there with a kind of a dark background. And as that crystallizes, it can never be moved again. Once you have crystals, they're not plastic anymore. They're not ductile. You can't bend them around. But the opening that will house a thunder egg happens between that ball and the material around it, which it turns out can be still moved. It's still hot enough. This is all happening in the liquid flow of rhyolitic material. And so the separation is going to take place when this spheruolite opens up to become a lithophysae, or I like to call them a thunder eggshell. It's going to happen right at where those two meet. The outer part is still plastic, still movable, and that hard part in the center is a solid object. So these are thunder egg shells. This is what forms first. These form and are completed while the flow is still ductile. And the material on the outside there and the one on the right, you can see a very typical thunder egg pattern. And as you can see, there's no agate there at all. So this is a totally distinct, separate step. It happens before the flow cools. And these things form. Here they've eroded out. And you can see indications of our familiar thunder egg core pattern. So the pattern that the agate takes is the pattern that's left when this is opened. And here's a couple of specimens. This is from the Deming area, the lava cap deposit. And in the center you can see what's called a box pattern, box core. On the bottom you can see that little hard object, the seed that the opening departed from, and up above it you can see the dimple on top that was originally sitting on top of that seed down at the bottom, and it just sort of opened accordion-like. And over on the right, this is from Oregon. This is an Oregon core, and it shows exactly the same pattern. You can see that if you cut through this core on the right, you'd get an agate a lot like the one that's shown on the left. Now, one of the questions here that's very interesting is, and I got this idea from Dr. Breitkreuz's paper, is the idea that as these open, the flow itself is under tension, and they're actually pulled open. And you can see that they open like an accordion, which is being pulled apart. They don't open like a bubble in basalt, which would be rounded. So you can also imagine, as you go from the right to the left, the thing closing up again. As an accordion opens, it can be closed. Every thunder egg that you look at, you can see how it could be folded back up and the cavity could disappear that way. So Dr. Breitkreuz's comment was that the carapace, that's the outside shell of a turtle, is also a term used to describe a rhyolitic flow. It cools on the outside, or any volcanic flow. It cools on the outside from releasing heat, and it cools on the bottom from resting on the ground. Cools on the front edge the same way the top cools. And you get hard rock all the way around the tip of the flow, while the inside is still molten and still hot. So as it cools and shrinks, there is a vacuum, like a lowering of pressure inside the material, and the outer shell can't be moved because it's solid rock. So this almost creates like a vacuum, which is the tensional force that pulls the thunder egg part, which is still fluid. You can see it changing. The dark part here is changing shape without breaking. So you know that that's still fluid. However, the center little seed there remains the same, and that's because it's already crystallized. So anyway, that's a comment on thunder egg formation, which was news to me. And I don't know whether this will turn out to be the correct explanation or not. These all take place inside a molten flow, and perhaps it will turn out that it's different than this. But I think that I think this is explanatory in some way, and will be part of what I think is accepted eventually as the explanation for the cavity formation in the eggs. Now, here is the USGS geologist I spoke about, Dr. Rick Hoblet, and we visited the pit. These pictures, I took these pictures when we were down in the pit, and he's very nice about sharing information. He has the soul of one of these park rangers, and is happy to explain stuff. And on the right-hand slide, you can see him up on the face of the Baker pit, and he was collecting from an area that hadn't been scraped by machinery, and so he was able to see the material of the pit. And he immediately suggested that this was not from an explosive eruption, because there were at least fragments that are recognizable in the hardened rock. He said there were none of those, so this came from a flow, probably a dome that had pushed out of this material. And he went back to Vancouver, Washington, where he lives, and then he sent me a map, a reference to a USGS map that describes the Hermanus area where the Baker deposit is, and they even mentioned the agates. So I'm going to have to read this because this is all in USGS language. But referring to this map, the authors of the geological map, Seeger and Clemens, have interpreted the deposit at the Baker Mine as the product of rhyolite dome emplacement, which just means the formation of one of these gloppy domes, and early explosive activity produced fragmented deposits which were subsequently intruded by irregular masses of rhyolite that originated from the dome and agate-bearing lithophysae from within So the map is listed in a handout, and I have this handout, a rough draft of it, available at my booth. If you want to interested in pursuing this further, then drop by and I can give you a printed copy of this. That ends my talk. We have quite a bit of time before lunch, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
I'm sure it's due to my lack of capacity to imagine things, but it's bothered me why, if those interior cavities open up according to any of the mechanisms that have been proposed, why the exterior of the thunder egg retains its symmetrically spherical shape.
I think that the answer would have to come from somebody who knows a lot about fluid mechanics and stuff, but if the material that does open up or is pushed open, whichever it is, whether it's a bubble or pulled apart, that the explanation would have to be that material that does yield a cavity is still ductile. And because it is ductile, and because the forces are uniform around it, they would have a tendency to equalize towards a circular form. And I believe that is the best I can do. And I appreciate the question, John.
Do you believe with enough money and the right mining equipment, you could go in there and still mine Bakers? Like there's still a deposit to mine?
I don't think so. You know, the last really productive mining came around 2012 or 13, 14, right in that period. They'd turned over, they'd gone to the left, and they found just a steady deterioration. However, that was the one area that produced the stalactites. The agate stalactites are such an interesting feature, variety of the Baker deposit. But I would like to point out, too, that I visited this pit with the miners, and they have described to me all of their various prospecting activities. And when they ran into a wall that no longer produced anything, they would cut trenches, some of them 40 feet deep, with a backhoe, exploring where they might hope that there might be some continuation without coming up with anything. So I think that this has really been exhaustively mined. And Lawrence Singh, the last person who insisted he didn't want to have it backfilled, he continued to do mining there after it had ceased to be even economically justifiable. And so I think the only way you would get material now there is if you wanted to start excavating in the backfill that's in the pit now. You might be able to find a thunder egg or two, but it certainly wasn't very productive. The days that I was out there, when they did the backfilling, there were a few eggs found, but a lot of, hundreds of tons of material were being moved in one shot, and so there were a few things that were found, but not many. And I would say that you wouldn't have a chance there. I think that it's too bad. I mean, the claim on the Baker covers 20 acres. And so all of these other little pits are under claim. And one of the most interesting ones, that Lindbergh or Tavernier pit, Eastern Tavernier pit, is the one that I think is most promising, and it's on state land. And if you want to dig on state land, you're going to have to do a whole lot of paperwork and put up a big bond. So I don't think there's a lot of chance for a person to go there. If you want to go dig thunder eggs around Deming, then there are the Little Florida Mountains, and on the southern and eastern part of the Little Florida Mountains, there are a number of deposits. I think they are under claim by Laurie Coleman. So I don't know how accessible that is. There's the Rockhound State Park has been dug pretty extensively. So I really don't know how much chance you would have, but it's certainly a great area, and there are other thunder egg deposits out there, so go for it.